Thank you for tuning in to Short Fiction Lab. You're listening to She Died in the Zombie Apocalypse, Woke Up 30 Days Earlier, and Left Her Boyfriend's Family to Fend for Themselves. She died in the zombie apocalypse, woke up 30 days earlier, and left her boyfriend's family to fend for themselves. Chapter 1. Waking Up Wrong. The first thing Maya Calloway noticed was the smell of her own sheets, that particular mix of fabric softener and sleep that she had scrubbed out of her memory over the last 47 days. The last 47 days of her life, as it turned out. She lay very still with her eyes open, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of her old apartment, the one shaped vaguely like the state of Florida that she used to fall asleep looking at. She hadn't seen that water stain in almost 2 months. The last time she'd seen it was from a very different position, flat on the floor with her hands zip-tied, and the last coherent thought she remembered having was something close to, "I should have left when I had the chance." She sat up slowly. Her phone was on the nightstand. The date glowed back at her from the lock screen, and she stared at it for a long time, reading it the way you read something you already know is true, but need to verify anyway. 30 days. She had exactly 30 days before the Eastern District reported its first cluster, before the news anchors started using the word containment with increasingly unconvincing confidence, before the grocery stores got picked clean in under 72 hours and the power grid began its long, stuttering farewell. She cried for 10 minutes. She allowed herself exactly that. 10 minutes on the edge of the bed, hands on her knees, letting the weight of everything she had watched happen move through her like a wave. She cried for the people she'd seen die on the streets below her old window. She cried for the months of careful preparation that had been dismantled one compromise at a time. She cried, maybe most of all, for the version of herself that had opened the door when Daniel knocked and thought, "This is what having a family feels like." Then she wiped her face, opened the drawer of her nightstand, took out a fresh notebook, and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Beneath it she wrote, "I know what is coming. This time I will be ready for all of it." She meant the zombies. She also meant the people. Chapter 2. What she remembered. Maya Calloway had aged out of the foster care system on her 18th birthday with a duffel bag, a GED certificate, and the quietly developed skill of making something out of very little. No parents she could name with any certainty. No siblings, no relatives who had ever materialized in any meaningful way. What she had instead was a brain that cataloged information obsessively and a personality that had learned through years of rotating households to read a room fast, to identify who was generous and who was performing generosity, to know the difference between someone who wanted to help her and someone who wanted credit for helping her. She'd gotten good at it. And then she'd gotten complacent, which is what happens when loneliness runs long enough that you start lowering the standards you swore you'd keep. By 23, she was working logistics for a mid-sized freight and distribution company, which turned out to be, against all odds, the perfect job for surviving the end of the world. She knew supply chains. She knew how to read an inventory and spot what was actually essential versus what felt essential. She knew that in any system, warehouse, household, or post-apocalyptic hideout, the single greatest threat to long-term stability was the gap between what you had and what the people around you thought you had. She knew all of this. She had just, in her first life, made the mistake of trusting someone with the information anyway. Daniel Park had been charming in the way that people are when nothing in their life has yet required them to be otherwise. He was warm, funny, a little careless with money, but generous about it in a way that felt like abundance rather than recklessness. His family was close-knit in the way Maya had always wanted a family to be. Loud dinners, opinions about everything, his mother calling on Sundays with the kind of cheerful intrusiveness that Maya had mistaken for a long, embarrassing time for affection. She understood now that she had projected a family onto them rather than observed the one that was actually there. The one that was actually there was the kind that weighed everything against everything and called it love. On day 22 of her first life, Daniel's mother had looked at Maya across the kitchen table, Maya's kitchen table, in Maya's apartment, surrounded by Maya's supplies, and said, with the tone of someone announcing a practical solution to a logistical problem, "You were always going to be useful eventually, sweetheart." The raiders had come for a second tribute collection the following morning, and Maya had been the tribute. She had survived it, barely and briefly, and then she hadn't survived it at all. And then she was here, on the edge of her bed, 30 days before the world ended, with a notebook in her lap and absolutely no intention of repeating any part of that sequence. Chapter 3. The List. The notebook filled up fast. She divided it into 3 sections: supplies, security, and intelligence. And inside each, she wrote everything she remembered with the focus of someone transcribing from a document rather than a memory. The intelligence section was the most personal and the most precise: which raider groups formed, when and in what order, which buildings they took over first, and why. The specific language Cross used when he announced terms to the tenants of her old building, standing in the lobby on day 18 with 4 armed men flanking him, explaining that this was a community arrangement and that everyone who cooperated would be protected and everyone who didn't was making a choice he couldn't be responsible for. She remembered the way the remaining tenants had mostly nodded and how that had seemed, at the time, like pragmatism, and how she now understood it was the beginning of a much longer and more painful arrangement. The supply section was meticulous in a way that would have looked, to an outside observer, like the work of someone who had been quietly preparing for precisely this scenario for years. Caloric requirements by person per day. Water consumption under low activity, moderate activity, and high-stress conditions. Medical supply priorities ranked by threat probability. Infection control first, then trauma management, then fever and pain, then the longer-term concerns, like dental and chronic condition management, that people always forgot about until they became critical. She wrote it all from memory and then went back through it twice, checking for gaps the way she used to audit inventory manifests at work. The security section was the one she spent the most time on, because security, she had come to understand, was not primarily about locks and weapons. It was about information management. The single most dangerous thing in a collapsed society was other people knowing what you had. Every raider group she had observed in her first life had started not with brute force, but with intelligence. Someone who knew which apartment had a stockpile, which floor had been organized, which tenant was sitting on 3 months of freeze-dried food and a medical kit. The violence came after the knowledge. Control the knowledge, and you change the entire sequence. She underlined this point 3 times and wrote beneath it, "No one can know I am here." Chapter 4. Finding 3105. She needed height above all else. In her first life, she had watched the undead move through the streets and lower floors with the relentless, directionless patience of a tide. They didn't decide to go up. They simply followed noise and movement, pooling at the base of buildings and pressing inward wherever a door or window gave them an opening. But they didn't look up. They never did. And the living, for the most part, didn't climb 30 floors unless they had very strong reason to. She needed to be at an altitude where both the dead and the desperate would pass her by without thinking to look. She toured 4 buildings over 5 days, moving through each one with the careful attention of someone who was thinking not about the apartment, but about what the apartment would become. She checked stairwell door weight and hardware. She found the utility and mechanical rooms. She walked the rooftops and estimated rainfall collection potential and line of sight for observation. She asked the leasing agents questions that she framed as concerns about building safety and aging infrastructure. Perfectly normal questions, easily explained. And from the answers she mapped each building's vulnerabilities. 3 were eliminated: wrong floor plan, too many uncontrolled access points, building management too present and attentive. The 4th was different. The Halcyon residential tower had been built in the early 2000s and showed its age in useful ways. Thick concrete construction, heavy fire doors on every floor, a stairwell configuration that offered real choke point potential, and a mechanical room accessible from a service corridor near the ground floor rear entrance. Unit 3105 was on the 31st floor, a corner unit with windows on two sides, 100 square feet, including a utility room that had been advertised as extra storage and that Maya immediately began mentally converting into a second supply cache. The 31st floor had 6 units in total, and based on the building's occupancy records that Maya had reviewed under the guise of asking about noise concerns from neighbors, was roughly 60% occupied, meaning several of those units sat empty for large portions of the week. The single elevator bank and 2 stairwells both terminated at the 31st floor, which meant she had exactly 2 points of vertical access to manage. She signed the lease in cash that same afternoon, and the leasing agent told her she was the most prepared tenant she'd ever processed. Maya smiled and said she'd just like to feel settled. Chapter 5. The Hoard. The shopping took 12 days and 14 trips, and she approached it with the same dispersal logic she used to apply to managing distributed freight. Spread the load, vary the routes, keep any single point in the system from becoming a visible pattern. She hit 7 different stores across 4 districts, rotating her days and times, paying in cash she had pulled from savings in small enough increments to avoid anything remarkable, wearing unremarkable clothes and buying unremarkable quantities. Not the panicked bulk buying of someone who knew what was coming, but the steady accumulation of someone stocking a large household or maybe a small restaurant. Enough canned goods to fill a pantry, enough medical supplies to outfit a thorough first aid kit, enough freeze-dried protein and sealed dry goods to suggest someone who took emergency preparedness seriously, but not obsessively. Each trip she brought home 1 or 2 bags. She carried them up 31 floors using the stairs, because she had already decided the elevator was a temporary convenience she would be eliminating. The utility room in 3105 became a floor-to-ceiling inventory. She built the shelving herself over 3 evenings, using flat-pack units she assembled quietly and without power tools after 9 in the evening. Each shelf was labeled, not with cheerful pantry labels, but with inventory codes she had designed herself, organized by category and expiration priority. The food she arranged in strict rotation order, oldest dates forward. The medical supplies she sorted by urgency tier. The tools and equipment, hand crank radio, shortwave scanner, portable propane stove, a gravity water filter, backup batteries, thermal blankets, rope, basic hardware, a well-stocked toolkit, occupied the bottom 2 shelves and were arranged for access speed rather than aesthetics. She stood in the doorway of the utility room when it was done and looked at it for a long time. It was, she thought, the most honest expression of herself she had ever produced. She installed secondary locks on the front door and reinforced the door frame herself, working from a tutorial she had memorized in the months before her first life ended. One of many things she had found online and bookmarked and thought, I should really do that, and never gotten around to. She installed blackout curtains doubled with thermal liners on every window. She mapped the hallway outside her door through careful listening at different times of day, identifying the 2 neighbors on her floor who seemed to be consistently present and the 3 units that showed patterns of extended absence. She was building a picture, the same way she had always built pictures at work, 1 data point at a time, until the shape became clear. Chapter 6. The Camera Network. She had 4 cameras in total, and she thought about their placement with more care than she had given to almost anything else in the preparation. 2 went into her old apartment. She visited it for the last time under the pretext of retrieving a few remaining personal items, which she actually did retrieve to maintain the appearance of a normal, gradual move. And while she was there, she mounted a small wireless camera inside the living room smoke detector and a second one in a discreet corner position in the kitchen, angled to cover the main cabinet where she had stored her old food supplies. She took her time. She moved unhurriedly. She was a woman collecting the last of her things from a place she used to live, and she did not look like anything else. The other 2 cameras she installed in the Halcyon Tower. One she placed in the smoke detector in the 31st floor hallway, positioned to cover the entire corridor from the elevator bank to the stairwell door. A clean, wide-angle view of anyone approaching her unit from either direction. The second she mounted inside the stairwell itself, on the 31st floor landing, angled downward toward the door below, so that she could see anyone working at that door before they got through it. All 4 feeds ran to a private local network, and displayed on a tablet she kept at her communication hub beside the shortwave radio and the battery-powered emergency broadcast receiver. She could, at any hour, see who was coming toward her from 4 different directions without leaving her chair. She did not tell Daniel she had moved. She forwarded her mail. She kept her old number. She answered his calls with the same warmth and distraction she had always used. "Sorry, work has been intense. You know how it gets at the end of quarter." And she met him once for coffee, 11 days before everything changed, and watched his hands around his cup and let him talk about a show he'd been watching and a minor frustration with his mother and the restaurant he wanted to try next month. He looked fine. He looked the way people look when nothing in their life has yet demanded that they be anything other than fine. She paid for the coffee. She hugged him at the corner of the street in the gray morning light and walked away without looking back, because she knew that if she looked back, she would feel something that could still complicate her thinking, and she had no room left for complicated thinking. She had 23 days. Chapter 7. The Elevator and the Doors. In her first life, the undead had reached the upper floors of her building by day 8. Not all at once and not in a dramatic wave. It had been more incremental and more horrifying for being so. A single infected tenant who had barricaded themselves in a 6th-floor unit and then stopped barricading. An elevator door that someone had propped open on the 3rd floor, creating a vertical corridor the dead were perfectly capable of navigating once one of them found the call button by accident and the others simply followed the noise. The elevator shaft had become, in effect, a highway running the full height of the building, and once you lost control of it, you lost the building floor by floor. She had spent a long time thinking about how to address this before the outbreak, because the obvious approach, disabling the elevator outright, would raise immediate questions from building management and neighbors if she did it too early. Instead, she had researched the Halcyon Tower's mechanical room in detail, had visited it twice under different pretexts, and had identified exactly what would need to happen to the elevator control panel to produce what would look, to any subsequent examination, like an ordinary mechanical failure. She bought the 2 small components she needed from a commercial hardware supplier and kept them in the top drawer of her nightstand. She would not use them until day 1, when the chaos outside would make an elevator outage the last of anyone's concerns. For the stairwell doors, she had pre-drilled the anchor points herself on a quiet Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks before the outbreak, telling a neighbor she passed in the hallway that she was installing a door stopper. The steel brackets and secondary bolts were already cut to size and stored in the utility room. On day 1, within hours of the first news reports, she would have both stairwell doors on the 31st floor secured to a standard that would take a sustained, noisy, organized effort to breach. The kind of effort that would give her ample warning, and more importantly, the kind that no casual survivor group passing through would find worth attempting when there were 30 unlocked floors below to work through first. Chapter 8. What she knew about raiders. The intelligence notebook had an entire section dedicated to the raider problem, and she had filled it with the careful, unsentimental detail of someone writing a case study rather than a personal account. The protection racket model was the dominant one, not because raiders were particularly creative, but because it worked and because it required the least violence to maintain once it was established. You moved into a building with enough armed people to make resistance obviously costly. You announced terms that were framed as a community arrangement. Everyone contributes, everyone benefits. We keep this place safe together. You conducted a census that was really an inventory. You set a tribute schedule that started manageable and increased over time as your position solidified and the alternatives for tenants narrowed. And then you let the logic of the situation do most of the work for you, because starving people in a collapsed world are not primarily thinking about collective resistance. They are thinking about the next meal and the meal after that, and anyone who is offering to guarantee those meals, even at a cost, is offering something very real. Cross had been the worst of the ones she observed in her first life, not because he was the most violent, but because he was the most patient. He didn't need to hurt people often because the threat was consistently credible and the structure he imposed was consistent enough that people adapted to it, adapted their expectations, their behavior, their moral accounting. By the time tenants in her old building understood that compliance wasn't survival, but just a slower version of the same outcome, the social infrastructure for resistance had been completely hollowed out. She had watched it happen from inside it and had not understood what she was watching until it was far too late. This time, the entire architecture of Unit 3105 was built around a single guiding principle: invisibility. Not just security. Security was secondary, because security was only necessary if someone already knew you were worth securing against. The primary line of defense was the simple fact of not existing, as far as the rest of the building and the city were concerned. No light bleeding under doors, no sounds that carried, no pattern of behavior visible to anyone who might catalog it and report it or act on it. She was building a ghost floor, 31 stories up, and the most important brick in that construction was the silence she intended to maintain around it. Chapter 9. 0 Hour. The outbreak began on a Tuesday morning, exactly as she remembered. She was already awake when the first news alert came through. Sitting at her communication hub with coffee and her notebook, monitoring the shortwave frequencies she had been tracking for the past week as they moved from routine government traffic to something with a different quality of urgency underneath it. The television news spent the first 4 hours in the register of serious but manageable before it shifted, abruptly and without a clean transition, into something that had no register because nothing had needed one before. By noon, the anchors had stopped trying to contextualize and started simply reporting what was in front of them, and by mid-afternoon, 2 of the major networks had gone to dead air. Maya watched it from her window without the shock that she imagined people in other units were feeling right now. She felt something closer to the grim satisfaction of a prediction confirmed. Not pleasure, nothing like pleasure, but the particular steadiness that comes from having prepared for the thing that is now happening rather than being unprepared for it. He ate lunch at her normal time. She updated her notebook with time-stamped observations of street-level activity, which was deteriorating faster than she remembered it. Deteriorating, suggesting either a more aggressive strain or simply the cascade effects of a city that was slightly more densely interconnected than her memory of it. Then, in the early afternoon, while the building around her buzzed with the muffled sounds of neighbors calling family and watching screens and moving furniture against doors, she took her pre-cut components downstairs to the mechanical room and did what needed to be done to the elevator control panel. She was back in 3105 within 20 minutes. The elevator sat still after that and did not move again. That evening, she installed the stairwell door reinforcements, both of them working efficiently with the tools she had laid out in order of use, the process as smooth as something she had rehearsed, which in a sense she had. The steel brackets seated cleanly into the pre-drilled anchor points, the secondary bolts locked without resistance. She checked each door by pressing her shoulder into it with her full weight, then more, and when neither moved, she allowed herself a single exhale that was as close to relief as she had felt in 30 days. She went back inside 3105, locked the door, and sat down at the communication hub. Outside, the city continued its transformation from the place she had lived in to something she had already learned to navigate. She opened the camera feeds and settled in for the long work of watching. Chapter 10. The Dead. She had tried to prepare herself, psychologically, for seeing them again. The dead that moved. The first time she had encountered one up close in her previous life, on day 4, it had been a neighbor from 2 floors below who she had recognized by the cardigan he always wore to check his mailbox, and the horror of it had been less the violence of the thing than the specific wrongness of the way it moved. Not the lurching slowness of movie fiction, but something almost more disturbing in how purposeful it seemed within its purposelessness. How it oriented toward her without decision, without anything resembling decision, purely on the signal of sound and movement, as though it had been reduced to a single biological instruction. She had never fully gotten used to it in her first life. She thought, watching them gather at the building's base from 31 floors up on day 2, that distance helped. Distance made them look almost like a weather pattern, something that moved according to its own logic and could be mapped and predicted and navigated around, which was exactly what she intended to do. They accumulated at noise sources, which meant that the lower floors of the Halcyon Tower were drawing them in through exactly the kind of uncontrolled activity that Maya had been careful to avoid. She could hear, from above, the sounds of people making the mistakes she remembered making in her first week. Raised voices, televisions at full volume, the particular racket of furniture being moved in panic rather than in plan. By day 3, there were at least 40 of the dead clustered at the building's main entrance, pressing at the glass lobby doors with the steady, indifferent patience of something that had nowhere else to be and no concept of time. By day 5, the lobby glass had given way, and she could hear, distantly, through concrete and 30 floors of vertical distance, the beginning of what happened next on the lower levels. She sat in her chair and noted the time, and did not open her door. On day 5, someone tried the stairwell door on the 31st floor. She watched it on the camera feed. A man in his late 30s, wearing a business shirt that had been cleaned maybe 2 days ago, pounding on the reinforced door with both fists for a little over 4 minutes, then pressing his ear to the gap, then pounding again, then standing still with his forehead against the steel for a long moment before he turned and went back down the stairs. She sat 12 feet away on the other side of that door and did not make a sound. She noted his face in the intelligence notebook, a sketch more than a description, because she had always found that drawing something fixed it in memory more cleanly than words. Then she went back to her supply rotation schedule. Chapter 11. The camera feed. The motion sensor on the old apartment camera activated on day 3 in the mid-afternoon. She was running a supply audit when the tablet chimed, and she looked over to find Daniel moving through her old living room with the speed of someone who had been going somewhere specific and had arrived. His mother came through the door behind him, then his sister with the 2 kids, the younger one still in pajamas, the older one carrying a backpack that was clearly too heavy for him. They moved through the apartment with the focused efficiency of people who had known exactly where they were going, which told her everything she needed to know about how much Daniel had told them and when. She watched his mother go directly to the kitchen. Directly to it, not orienting, not exploring, but going there with the purpose of someone who had been given a description. She opened the cabinets in sequence and stood looking at what was inside with an expression that Maya, watching on a 4-inch screen from 31 floors and several miles away, could read without difficulty. It was the expression of someone taking inventory of something they had already decided belonged to them. The decoy stash Maya had left. 1 shelf of canned goods, dry pasta, a modest medical kit, several liters of bottled water, carefully calibrated to seem like a windfall without being so large that it would prompt questions about why Maya wasn't there to be sharing it, had done its job. It would make them comfortable. It would make them stay. She watched the feed in the evenings when the light in the apartment went low and the family moved through the rooms in the flicker of candles and a battery lantern they had thought to bring. She watched Daniel sit at her old kitchen table on day 6 with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes at a middle distance, and she recognized the look of someone finally processing that the life they had known was not paused but finished, that the texture of everything going forward was going to be fundamentally different from everything before, and that the mental inventory they were quietly conducting was not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it and more practical. He tried calling her number on day 7. She watched the notification on her phone and did not pick up. She turned the phone face down and went back to her supply rotation. She felt something she didn't have a good word for, some compound of the thing that was almost grief, and the thing that was almost relief, and the thing that was very much like the quiet of a decision already made. Chapter 12. Day 11. She had been marking the days in the intelligence notebook, and when day 11 arrived, she didn't need the mark to know it. She had been watching the old building on the external feeds for the preceding 48 hours, tracking the shape of what was building, the new vehicles that appeared in the street outside and didn't move, the pattern of activity at the building's entrance that spoke of organization rather than desperation, the specific quality of control that had been, in her first life, the first visible sign of Cross's operation consolidating. She sat at the hub with her coffee, and she watched and she waited. The approach came in the early evening. She watched the figures in the stairwell of her old building, moving floor by floor, the way a tide moves, steady and without hurry, because hurry was for people who weren't certain of the outcome. The knock on the apartment door, when it came, had the particular cadence of something that was less a question than a statement of presence. She couldn't hear the conversation through the camera's audio, which was limited and intermittent, but she could see the body language with painful clarity. Daniel stood in the door opening, and she watched him do the thing she had watched him do before. The initial straightening, the posture of someone about to refuse, followed by the sideways glance into the apartment where his mother and his sister's 2 children were visible, and then the slow deflation, the shoulder drop that was the physical expression of a man choosing the option that felt survivable, even if it wasn't the one he wanted to choose. His mother stepped forward into the doorway. There was a gesture toward the kitchen, toward the supplies. There was a further gesture, toward the back of the apartment, the kind of open-palmed offering gesture that she had seen before, and that she now watched again with the strange, removed quality of someone watching a scene they have already memorized from a different vantage point. In her first life, that gesture had included her. The thing being offered had been Maya herself, her skills, her knowledge of where else in the city supplies might be found, her value as a bargaining piece in a negotiation that had been happening without her knowledge for days. In this life, the back of the apartment was empty. There was nothing there to offer. Whatever compromise Daniel's mother was brokering, it was being made without Maya as currency, and whatever it cost them was a debt Maya had not incurred and would not be paying. She closed the camera feed. She finished her dinner, canned soup with crackers, carefully portioned, eaten at the small table she had set up facing the window so she could watch the city below while she ate. She opened the intelligence notebook and wrote, in the steady handwriting she had maintained, even when her hands wanted to shake. Day 11. Raider consolidation confirmed at old building. Protection arrangement entered. Decoy stash transferred as initial tribute. She paused with the pen hovering. Then she wrote, "They would have traded me again. The same variables, the same people, the same calculation. The outcome would have been identical. The only thing I changed was my presence." She closed the notebook. She washed her bowl. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept better than she had any right to. Chapter 13. The 31st Floor. By day 15, Maya had built a detailed picture of the 5 other units on her floor through nothing more than careful listening and camera observation. Unit 3101 was empty. The couple who'd lived there had apparently gotten out in the first 48 hours, moving with the speed of people who had either been prepared or been lucky. Unit 3103 was also empty. Unit 3102 had a single occupant, a woman Maya estimated to be in her mid-50s, who had not opened her door since day 2, but whose careful, minimal movements she could track acoustically through the concrete. Someone who was frightened but not panicking, which in Maya's estimation was the most workable kind of frightened. Unit 3104 showed 2 occupants based on sound patterns, cautious and quiet. Unit 3106 had gone completely silent after what sounded like a door opened too loudly on day 8 and was then shut and apparently not opened again. On day 17, there was a knock on her door. 3 beats, then 2, then 3. Deliberate, not random, a signal rather than a plea. She looked at the hallway camera and saw a woman in scrubs standing with her hands visible at her sides, looking directly and calmly at the smoke detector above the door. Not at the door itself, at the smoke detector, because she had figured out that was where the camera was. Maya sat very still for a long moment, looking at a woman who had correctly identified that she was being watched and had chosen to make herself legible rather than hide the knowledge. That was a non-trivial thing to do. It suggested a particular kind of thinking. She didn't open the door on day 17. She opened it on day 18, chain on 6 inches, and she said through the gap, "Tell me who you are and what you're proposing and be specific, because I don't have patience for vague right now." The woman in scrubs was Dr. Soo-Jin Park, Unit 3104, Emergency Medicine, who had been off a long rotation when the outbreak began and had never made it back to the hospital. She had her emergency medical bag, a week of personal supplies, a downstairs neighbor she'd been quietly caring for, and a 17-year-old boy she had found on day 3, curled in the stairwell 1 floor below with his knees to his chest and his eyes tracking every movement. Brought him back to her unit by instinct, she said. The way you stabilize a patient before you assess them. She spoke clearly and without performance. And she said she wasn't asking to share resources, only to observe that isolation wasn't a strategy so much as a slower version of the same problem, and that 2 units with different skill sets might represent something more durable than 6 units of parallel silence. Maya stood in her doorway, chain still on, and thought about it for longer than was comfortable. Then she said, "I'm going to write up terms. Come back tomorrow morning." Chapter 14. New terms. She spent the evening writing the arrangement with the same precision she had applied to every other document in the preparation. It was not long, barely a page, but it was specific in ways that mattered, covering contribution structure, decision-making protocol, supply transparency between members without external disclosure, and an explicit framework for conflict resolution that she had designed to prevent the kind of drift she had watched happen in her first life, where informal arrangements became assumed, assumptions became resentments, and resentments became the fault lines along which everything eventually broke. She printed it on a single sheet using her battery-powered portable printer, something she had included in her supplies on the specific basis that the ability to make things physical and signed was worth its weight in the world she was preparing for. The following morning, she slid 2 copies under the door of 3104. Soo-Jin read it in full, asked 2 questions through the door, both good ones, both catching genuine ambiguities that Maya acknowledged and revised, and then signed both copies and passed one back. The boy with her, who had not yet offered a name, watched the whole exchange from the hallway with the expression of someone cataloging information they intended to use later. He was wiry and quiet, in the way of someone who had learned that quietness was its own kind of capability. And when Soo-Jin introduced him as the young man I found in the stairwell, he didn't correct the description, but he did, for the first time, make direct eye contact with Maya through the gap in the door. She held it. He held it. She opened the door. Jerry Okafor from Unit 3106 came aboard 2 days later, arriving at her door with his signed copy of the arrangement and a very specific question about the elevator shaft that told her immediately he had been thinking about the building's structural vulnerabilities in exactly the same terms she had. He was 61, a retired electrical and structural contractor who had spent 30 years working commercial and residential construction. And he looked at what she had done to the stairwell doors with an expression that moved from assessment through approval and into something that was almost professional respect. He completed the elevator shaft ceiling in a way she hadn't considered, a secondary physical barrier that prevented upward movement through the shaft even if the mechanical disable were somehow reversed. And he reinforced the stairwell doors with a solution of his own design that Maya was fairly certain would hold against anything short of a structured demolition attempt. She updated the security section of her notebook with his additions and noted the date. The boy started drawing maps on day 20. He had found the building's maintenance corridors and HVAC access routes in the days before he joined them, navigating the building's internal skeleton with an ease that suggested either unusual spatial intelligence or a prior life that had involved moving through spaces that weren't meant for him. He brought the first map to Maya without being asked. A detailed sketch of the utility shaft system connecting the 31st floor to the roof access, annotated with dimensions and access points, and a note in very small handwriting about a water collection point he had found at the base of the rooftop HVAC housing. She looked at the map for a long time. She looked at him. He shrugged, which was apparently his version of, "You're welcome." She started calling him Ren because the name suited the way he moved through the building's hidden places, and eventually It stuck, and eventually he answered to it, which she chose to interpret as its own kind of yes. Diane Chen from Unit 3102 was the last to join and the most reluctant, coming to the door on day 23 only because she had run out of something she absolutely needed and was willing to knock to get it. She was a retired school teacher in her late 60s who had been window gardening for 20 years and had consequently brought with her into the apocalypse 6 trays of growing herbs, 2 small tomato plants, and a collection of seed packets that she kept in a cedar box as though they were documents of some importance, which Maya was beginning to understand they were. She brought them to the arrangement table with the careful dignity of someone who knew exactly what they were contributing and was not going to pretend otherwise. The group was complete. Chapter 15. The System. The 31st floor found its rhythm in the way that good systems do. Not dramatically, not with any particular moment of breakthrough, but through the steady accumulation of working days. Supply was inventoried and rotated on Maya's schedule, which she posted on the utility room door and updated weekly. Medical situations moved to Sujin, whose corner of Unit 3104 had been converted into something that was not quite a clinic, but was considerably more than a first aid station. Jerry handled all structural and electrical work, including the gradual process of extending Wren's roof access infrastructure into a functioning rainwater collection system and a solar charging setup for their critical devices. Wren provided intelligence. His routes through the building's internal systems gave them a picture of every floor's status with a regularity and accuracy that would have been impossible to achieve from the outside. And Diane grew things, quietly and with great attention, in the window light of Unit 3102, and brought small quantities of fresh food to the table at intervals that felt, in the gray monotony of canned and dried provisions, like something close to ceremony. The radar sweep on day 22 was the first real test of the floor's invisibility, and it passed without incident. The group Wren had been tracking for 2 days moved through the building like weather, floor by floor, systematic and loud, and stopped at the 28th floor where the stairwell door resisted in the way of something mechanically failed rather than deliberately blocked. They tried 29, which held even more firmly. They spent 15 minutes on the 30th floor, found nothing useful, and moved on. The 31st floor was never tried. Maya watched the whole sequence on camera in real time, logging each timestamp, and when the last of them had cleared the building, she looked at Jerry and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. Chapter 16. What the Radio Said. The government broadcast came on day 28, and it came simultaneously across every frequency that still had signal, a saturation broadcast, which itself told you something about the infrastructure behind it, because saturation broadcasting across multiple channels was not an improvised emergency measure. It required pre-positioned relay systems, coordinated timing, and a script that had clearly been written and rehearsed before the event it was responding to. The voice was warm and measured and authoritative in the specific calibrated way of someone delivering a prepared message rather than speaking extemporaneously in a crisis, and it spoke of survivor processing camps at established coordinates, of transportation assistance, of food and medicine and protection, of the importance of registration, of community and recovery, and the long work of rebuilding. Jerry listened to it twice from beginning to end without speaking. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees and his head slightly down, the posture of a man thinking carefully, and when the broadcast cycled through a second time, he let it finish and then sat back and said, in a tone that was careful and quiet, "Infrastructure like that, the camps, the relay systems, the distribution networks they're describing, that doesn't get built in 4 weeks. Not any of it. The logistics alone for pre-positioning food and medicine at multiple regional sites would take the better part of a year to run through procurement and delivery. I've bid on government contracts. I know what that timeline looks like." He stopped. No one spoke for a moment. Sujin, who was standing at the window with her arms crossed, said quietly, "They knew this was coming." And the word they hung in the air of the 31st floor with a weight that nobody in the room found it comfortable to look at directly, but nobody was able to look away from either. Chapter 17, Volume 2. Maya had been keeping a separate section in the margins of the intelligence notebook, a running collection of fragments that she hadn't known what to do with individually, but that she had continued logging because she had worked in logistics long enough to know that anomalies you can't explain immediately are worth holding on to until the pattern becomes clear. A shipping manifest she had photographed during a supply run on day 19, found tucked between inventory boxes in a commercial warehouse she'd accessed through Wren's interior routes. A biohazard transport company's routing document with a contract date 14 months before the outbreak, and a destination that she recognized from her freight industry background as having no legitimate reason to receive biological materials at that volume and at that routing priority. A federal emergency management exercise notice from 8 days before the outbreak, covering the exact origin region of the first reported cluster, which she had noted in passing in her first life, and now could not read with anything resembling innocence. The language of the survivor broadcast itself, not "we are establishing," but "we have established," past tense, completed infrastructure already built and waiting for the event that would make it necessary. She laid it out on paper on the night of day 29 and sat with it. She was not a conspiracy theorist. She was a logistics coordinator with 15 years of experience reading supply chains, and what she was looking at was a supply chain, one that had been assembled before there was any public reason to assemble it, for a crisis that had apparently been anticipated before there was any public reason to anticipate it. She didn't know who had known, or how far up it went, or whether the outbreak had been an accident that someone had merely prepared to profit from, or something more deliberate and more terrible than that. She didn't have enough of the pattern yet to say. But she had been in enough warehouses to know that no supply chain assembles itself without someone doing the planning. And the planning always starts long before the need is officially acknowledged. And the people who do that kind of planning in that kind of silence are not doing it for reasons that are going to look good once they're visible. She went to the supply shelf in the utility room and found the fresh notebook she had set aside. She brought it back to the hub, sat down, and on the first page she wrote 2 words in large letters: "Who knew?" Beneath it she began the list, starting with what she had, and leaving space for what she would find. The government broadcast cycled through its coordinates again outside on the shortwave, patient and warm and waiting, the voice of a system that had prepared itself for exactly this moment. Maya turned down the volume and turned up the scanner, moving through the frequencies that weren't being broadcast on, listening for the traffic that moved between official channels when official channels thought no one was monitoring. There was something there. It was fragmented and coded, and she could only make out pieces of it, but it was there, and it had the texture of something that was not emergency response but coordination, the sound of a plan proceeding. She wrote it down. She labeled the notebook Volume 2. 31 floors above a dead city, in a unit that didn't officially exist in anyone's accounting of surviving residents, Maya Calloway, orphan, logistics coordinator, woman who had already died once in this particular disaster and had declined to do so again, uncapped her pen and started the next part of the work. She had survived the people who wanted to use her. She had survived the dead that wanted to consume her. What she was looking at now was something different from either, something that had wanted this to happen, or had at the very least looked at the possibility of it and decided to be ready rather than to prevent it. She thought about Daniel's mother's face in the kitchen of her old apartment, doing inventory on things that weren't hers, and she thought about the measured voice on the radio doing inventory on survivors, and she thought that the scale was different, but the logic was recognizable. It was the logic of people who divided the world into resources and people who managed resources, and who had quietly, over a long period of planning, arranged to be on the managing side of that division when the time came. She was not going to walk into a registration camp, not yet, maybe not ever. But she was going to find out what was behind it, the same way she had found out what was behind everything she had survived, by watching carefully, recording precisely, and refusing to mistake the explanation she was being offered for the explanation that was actually true. Outside, the city breathed its new and unfamiliar breath. The dead moved through the streets below in patterns she had already begun to map. Somewhere across the city, in her old apartment, Daniel's family was navigating whatever arrangements they had entered into with whatever raiders had found them useful, and Maya felt the complex thing she had been feeling about that, and did not try to resolve it into something simpler than it was. She had not done anything to them. She had simply, and at considerable personal cost, stopped doing things for them. Whatever happened next in that apartment was a consequence of choices that had been made long before the world ended, by people who had looked at her and seen a resource rather than a person, and the world had simply gotten honest about what that had always meant. She closed Volume 2 for the night. She would open it in the morning and keep going. There was a great deal more to find out, and she had supplies for 6 more weeks, and she had people around her now who were worth finding out alongside. Through the window, the first gray light of day 30 was beginning at the edge of the sky, and somewhere in the Halcyon Tower, Diane's herbs were growing in their trays on the windowsill, and Jerry was probably already awake with his coffee thinking about the roof system, and Soo-jin was sleeping the deep sleep of someone who had been working for weeks without rest and had finally found a place solid enough to rest in, and Ren was probably in a duct somewhere, which was where Ren preferred to be, and Maya found that she was all right with all of this. Not happy exactly, and not safe exactly, but oriented, clear, moving towards something rather than away from it. That was, she had decided, the most she could ask of any particular day. She made coffee. She opened the notebook. She began. End of Volume 1. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please like this video and subscribe to support our channel so that I can bring more stories like this to you.